Imagine this scene as you listen. The sun blazed down on a winding highway, its golden rays bouncing off the polished chrome of an SUV cruising through the serene countryside. The air was warm, almost sticky, but carried the faint scent of wildflowers and freshly cut grass. Inside the car sat two larger-than-life figures, John Cena and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. These weren't just celebrities. They were men who had earned their fame not only for their strength but for their unshakable moral compass. They weren't superheroes. They didn't wear capes or have superhuman powers, but they believed in doing what was right, no matter how hard it got. This day, however, wasn't about saving the world or headlining sold-out arenas. It was supposed to be simple, a rare break from their hectic schedules, a chance to enjoy each other's company and the freedom of the open road. Their loyal Labrador, Rocky, sat in the back seat, his nose sticking out the window, sniffing at the fresh air like he owned it. His fur ruffled in the breeze, catching bits of sunlight that made him look like a living, breathing golden statue. The trio radiated contentment, unaware that fate had something else planned for them. As they approached a small town nestled between rolling hills, Dwayne pointed to a quaint cafe with wooden benches outside. "That looks like a good spot," he said casually, his deep voice filled with calm assurance. Little did they know, this stop would turn into far more than lunch. It would become a test of courage, unity, and humanity. The cafe buzzed softly with life, a harmonious blend of clinking cups and murmured conversations. Locals lounged on wooden benches outside, sipping coffee under the warm daylight. Children played nearby, their laughter ringing out like music in the crisp air. Among them were 4 kids, 3 boys and 1 girl, all around 10 years old. They chased each other, kicking a worn soccer ball across the pavement. But there was an undercurrent of unease in their movements. These kids knew better than to draw too much attention to themselves. In this quiet town, standing out often meant trouble. Their skin tone made them stand out here, and they'd learned the hard way that not everyone treated them kindly. When Rocky caught their eye, curiosity overcame caution. Jaden, the boldest of the group, a boy with determined eyes and a mop of dark, unruly hair, couldn't resist asking if they could pet him. To their surprise, John and Dwayne nodded warmly. "He's friendly," John assured them, his voice calm but inviting. As the kids gathered around Rocky, giggling and scratching behind his ears, the scene felt almost magical, a fleeting moment of pure joy. Rocky wagged his tail furiously, rolling onto his back for belly rubs. For a brief moment, everything felt right. Inside the cafe, John and Dwayne settled into their meal, glancing occasionally through the window to check on Rocky and the kids. Everything seemed peaceful, almost idyllic. But peace, especially in towns like this, is fragile. And even as they enjoyed their burgers, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. The first sign of trouble came as a distant rumble, a sound too loud to belong to anything natural. It started faintly, almost like thunder rolling in from far away. But the sky above was clear, painted in soft shades of blue and gold. Moments later, motorcycles roared into view, their engines growling like predators circling prey. Each bike gleamed menacingly under the bright sun, its chrome reflecting sharp glints of light that seemed almost threatening. At the helm was Roy Grim Harper, a man whose reputation preceded him. His greasy hair hung messily over his forehead, streaked with dirt and sweat. A thick beard covered most of his face, but it couldn't hide the coldness in his eyes that scanned the area like a wolf sizing up its territory. He wore a faded leather jacket adorned with skull patches and insignias, each one telling a story of violence and intimidation. His boots were scuffed, their soles rough and worn, hinting at countless miles traveled on paths no decent person would dare walk. When Roy dismounted, he did so with deliberate slowness, every movement calculated to draw attention. His gaze landed on the kids and Rocky, and his lips curled into a sneer. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. Looks like we've got some stray dogs hanging around here. Jaden stiffened, anger flickering in his eyes. He wanted to say something, to defend himself and his friends, but fear held him back, for now. Roy's taunts grew louder, his words cutting deeper. "You don't belong here," he spat, glaring at Jaden with those cold, merciless eyes. The boy clenched his fists, trembling with a mix of rage and fear. Behind him, Rocky growled low in his throat, sensing the danger. When Roy kicked Rocky hard in the ribs, the dog yelped in pain, and the spell of silence broke. Jaden shouted, rushing to Rocky's side. Tears welled in his eyes, but instead of backing down, he stood tall, facing Roy despite the terror coursing through him. "You're wrong," Jaden said, his voice shaking but defiant. "We have every right to be here." Roy's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of fury. "Oh yeah? Let's see how tough you are, kid." He raised his fist, but before he could strike, a commanding voice cut through the tension. "Try it," came the steady warning. Everyone turned to see John Cena and Dwayne Johnson stepping out of the cafe, their towering figures casting long shadows. Roy blinked, momentarily stunned. Then arrogance took over. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he barked, his voice dripping with false bravado. He tried to mask his uncertainty, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering between John and Dwayne like a cornered animal searching for an escape. John stepped forward, his expression unreadable but his tone lethal. "Apologize. Now." Roy's laugh was brittle, forced. "Or what? You gonna cry about it?" The air crackled with tension. It felt like time itself had slowed down, every breath heavier, every heartbeat louder. Rocky, still lying on the ground, let out another low growl, his ears pinned back and his eyes locked onto Roy. Jaden stood close by, clutching Rocky's fur, his knuckles white from gripping so tightly. Without warning, one of Roy's lackeys lunged at Dwayne, hoping to catch him off guard. Big mistake. Dwayne sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing the man by the jacket and slamming him into a parked motorcycle. The metal groaned under the impact, and the biker collapsed, groaning in pain. Chaos erupted as the rest of Roy's gang surged forward. John moved with precision, dodging strikes and delivering devastating blows. Together, he and Dwayne dismantled the bikers with ruthless efficiency, their years of training evident in every calculated move. One biker swung a chain, aiming for John's head. But John caught it mid-swing, yanking hard and pulling the man off balance before driving a heavy fist straight into his stomach. The biker folded in half, gasping for air, before collapsing onto the ground. Another lunged at Dwayne with a broken bottle, but Dwayne grabbed the man's wrist mid-strike, twisting until the weapon clattered harmlessly to the ground. With a swift knee to the gut, he disarmed the man completely, leaving him kneeling and wheezing. The street echoed with the sounds of fists hitting flesh, motorcycles toppling over, and the occasional shout of pain. Roy watched in disbelief as his men fell one by one, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. Roy watched in disbelief as his men fell one by one, his face contorted with rage, but beneath that was something else, something closer to panic. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small knife. The blade glinted under the harsh midday sun, catching the light like a deadly star. "Let's see how tough you really are," he snarled, lunging toward John. But John was faster. He grabbed Roy's wrist mid-swing, twisting it with unyielding force until the knife clattered harmlessly to the ground. Roy grunted in pain, his knees buckling as John forced him down. "You pull a weapon unless you're ready to use it," John said coldly. "And you're not ready." Dwayne loomed over Roy, his shadow casting a dark silhouette across the man's defeated form. His voice thundered, each word hitting like a hammer. "Pick up that knife. I dare you." Roy hesitated, his eyes darting between the knife and the two men towering above him. For a moment, it seemed like he might try something desperate. But then his shoulders slumped, and he spat on the ground, shame burning in his eyes. Without another word, he stumbled to his feet, gesturing for his battered gang to follow. They limped away, their motorcycles groaning back to life. The sound of their engines faded into the distance, leaving behind only silence, and the lingering tension of what had just happened. After the dust settled, the town gathered around John, Dwayne, and the children. The air was thick with emotions, relief, gratitude, admiration, but also a lingering tension, like the aftermath of a storm that had shaken everyone to their core. Rocky lay on the ground, his golden-brown fur ruffled and his ribs still sore from Roy's cruel kick. But despite his injuries, he wagged his tail weakly, earning pats and praises from everyone who approached. His loyalty and courage hadn't gone unnoticed, and even the toughest-looking townsfolk couldn't help but smile as they knelt to scratch behind his ears. Jaden stood close to the two men, his earlier fear replaced by admiration. He looked up at them with wide eyes, his heart pounding not from terror this time, but from something else, something closer to wonder. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. It wasn't just about what they'd done, it was about how they'd made him feel. For the first time in a long while, he felt safe. John knelt beside him, meeting his gaze. His eyes were calm but intense, the kind that made you feel seen. "You didn't need us to stand up for you, Jaden," he said, his voice steady but kind. "You already showed real bravery today. Don't ever forget that." Dwayne added, his deep voice thunderous yet soothing, "Strength isn't about being bigger or stronger. It's about protecting what matters, even when you're scared." The words hit Jaden like a ton of bricks, but in the best way possible. He felt something shift inside him, like a door opening to a new understanding. He glanced down at Rocky, then back at John and Dwayne, and nodded slowly. "I'll remember," he promised, his voice trembling but determined. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the town began to shift. The initial shock of what had just happened gave way to something new, something hopeful. People who had spent years living in fear of Roy Harper and his gang started to talk openly, their voices rising with a mix of relief and determination. The cafe owner, a wiry man with salt and pepper hair and weathered hands, stepped forward, wiping them nervously on his apron. "I've lived here my whole life," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "I've seen a lot, but I've never seen anyone stand up to those animals the way you two did." He shook his head, a mixture of admiration and regret in his eyes. "Maybe we should have done it ourselves a long time ago." John nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful but firm. "It's not about who did it," he said calmly. "It's about making sure it doesn't happen again." The owner sighed deeply, then looked around at his fellow townspeople, most of whom were now gathered together, watching and listening. For the first time, they weren't thinking about hiding. They were thinking about the future. About standing together instead of apart. "Maybe it's time we stop being afraid," the owner mused aloud, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. "Maybe it's time we remember that this is our home." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd. Heads nodded, eyes met, and for the first time in years, there was a sense of unity, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. Jaden stood up suddenly, his movement drawing everyone's attention. He walked over to Rocky, kneeling beside him. "Thank you," he whispered, hugging the dog tightly. "You're the bravest dog I've ever seen." Rocky licked the boy's face gently, his tail wagging as if he understood every word. The other children gathered around, each taking turns petting Rocky, laughing softly. Their earlier fear was gone, replaced by pure admiration. It was clear that for them, this day would never be forgotten. John and Dwayne watched the scene unfold, exchanging a look of quiet satisfaction. Dwayne spoke first, his tone light but sincere. "Well, I think that calls for one last round of burgers, don't you think?" The cafe owner laughed and waved a hand. "On the house. After today, you two eat free anytime you're in town." John smiled but shook his head. "We didn't do this for free food. We did it because it was right." The old man nodded understanding. "Still, it's the least we can do." As night fell, the golden hues of sunset faded into a deep velvet sky dotted with twinkling stars. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of damp grass and earth. John Cena and Dwayne Johnson stood by their SUV, preparing to leave the small town that had unexpectedly become a battleground earlier that day. Their towering figures cast long shadows under the dim glow of the cafe's outdoor lights, but there was no mistaking the calm resolve in their eyes. The children gathered around them, their faces alight with gratitude and awe. Jaden stepped forward, his unruly dark hair falling over his forehead as he looked up at the two men who had changed everything. His striped green t-shirt was slightly dusty from the day's events, but his spirit was anything but worn. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling but filled with sincerity. "I'll never forget what you did." John smiled softly, placing a reassuring hand on Jaden's shoulder. "You don't need to thank us, kid. You were the brave one today. Remember that." Dwayne nodded, his deep voice thunderous yet gentle. "People like Roy, they thrive on fear. But when good people stand together, they can't win. Never forget that." The kids exchanged glances, their eyes shining with a mixture of pride and determination. They promised to remember, to hold on to the lessons they'd learned. Even Rocky seemed to understand the weight of the moment, wagging his tail weakly as he nudged Jaden's hand. The cafe owner approached, his weathered face cracking into a grateful smile. "You two are always welcome here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you did, changing this town, it's something we'll never forget." John and Dwayne shook hands with the man, their expressions humble but resolute. "We didn't do it for thanks," John replied calmly. "We did it because it was right." With one last pat on Rocky's head, the trio climbed into the SUV. The engine roared to life, its sound breaking the quiet night. As they pulled away, the children waved frantically, their laughter ringing out like music. Jaden shouted one last time, his voice carrying across the empty street, "Thank you for everything." John turned, giving the boy a thumbs up through the window. "Take care, kid." Weeks passed, and the story of what happened in that small town spread like wildfire. People talked about it everywhere, at dinners, in barbershops, even on social media. The legend grew with every retelling, but one thing remained constant: the image of two men who didn't hesitate to stand up when it mattered most. In the town itself, life began to change. The cafe owner started holding community meetings, encouraging people to speak up if they saw injustice. Jaden and his friends became local heroes, not because they fought Roy, but because they refused to back down. Their bravery inspired others to do the same. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and orange, Jaden sat outside his house with Rocky by his side. The dog's fur had healed, though a small scar remained near his ribs, a permanent mark of the day he protected the children. Jaden ran his hands through Rocky's fur, smiling softly. "You're still the bravest dog I know," he whispered. His mother stepped out onto the porch, her arms crossed against the cool night air. "You've changed, Jaden," she said gently. "You're not afraid anymore." Jaden looked up, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm not going back to being scared. John and Dwayne showed me that." Meanwhile, far away, Roy Harper rode through the night, his face twisted in anger. His body still ached from the beating he took, but it was nothing compared to the shame that burned inside him. He knew he'd met his match, but worse, he knew the town wasn't scared of him anymore. For a man like Roy, that was the ultimate defeat. As for John and Dwayne, they continued their lives, traveling from one city to the next, doing what they did best, inspiring others. But they often thought about that day. Not just about the fight, but about the moments afterward. The way the town came together. The way the kids looked at them with hope in their eyes. One night, as they sat around a campfire during a road trip, Dwayne broke the silence. "You think we made a difference?" John smiled, staring into the flames. "We gave them something to believe in. That's enough."
And that's where our story ends. What did you think of this story? Share your emotions in the comments below. We'd love to know what you remember most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And if you are in the mood for another exciting story, check out our next video. It's waiting for you. Until then, stay curious, get inspired, and keep exploring the stories that make life extraordinary. See you in the next one.